As you've undoubtedly heard, Microsoft has put forth their intention to acquire Activision Blizzard for nearly $70 billion. This comes off of a chain of increasingly high-profile developer and publisher acquisitions that Microsoft has been making over the past few years to bolster its previously thin first-party lineup. They started off with mostly smaller, independent development teams like Ninja Theory. Then in 2020, their purchase of Bethesda really took things to the next level. Personally, I saw that as sort of the bow on top of that streak of purchases. In other words, it was a move that I didn't expect to see surpassed anytime soon, if ever. Yet here we are, with an acquisition that dwarfs that. Bethesda only set them back a mere $7.5 billion. It is huge news, no one was expecting it, and there is much to discuss. I'll also briefly touch on the Sony and Bungie news at the end. Right off the bat, we've learned more about Microsoft's intentions and their strategy. Buying developers is nothing new. Sony does it, Valve does it, and the Xbox itself was built upon Microsoft's acquisition of Bungie. With those typically smaller indie devs, bringing them under the corporate roof gives them access to bigger budgets, resources, and visibility. You bring them in, foster them, and then their games become those elusive tentpole titles that drive people to your system. In the case of Bethesda, out of the AAA publishers, they are relatively small. Microsoft has a history with them, Morrowind was an Xbox console exclusive, and they, especially BGS, could probably use the extra resources and management. I mean, that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but you could make that argument. With Activision, I can't see that argument. What can Microsoft do for them? They have all the resources in the world, they're huge, and COD is consistently chart-topping any given month. It's Microsoft's most boring and cynical purchase yet, and it's now hard to argue that their approach is not to just literally buy whatever they can to have exclusivity to it, which sucks. That doesn't add any value, unless you're a Game Pass subscriber, which is yet another initiative that would be an unsustainable non-starter were Microsoft not so cash flush. This is a very shotgun approach where they're doing a lot of different things, spending a lot of money, but where do they want this to end up, and how does it ever lead to making more money? Like, I get it, spend money if you have it, make a Surface Duo 2 because fuck it, but even from a money-no-object perspective, I just don't see what you'd be so eager to own here. Because other than COD, which is of course huge, we'll get to that in a second, nothing immediately came to my mind. So let's just go through the past 5 years of Activision-published console games sans Call of Duty. Destiny 2, the Crash Bandicoot Remaster Trilogy, the Spyro Remaster Trilogy, Sekiro, Crash Team Racing Remaster, Tony Hawk Remaster, and Crash 4. Bungie and Activision are now a distant memory, and doing Sekiro with Activision was a weird one-off thing for From Software that has its roots in that game originally being a Tenchu sequel. So that leaves Spyro, Crash, and Tony Hawk. Not exactly a roster you'd pay $70 billion or even $7 billion for. I'm not trying to trash those properties, but outside of Crash 4, it's all remaster content, and I don't think there's much more to do with it. Look at what Phil Spencer said in this interview. Even he doesn't seem to know what he just inherited. That leaves Call of Duty, which is not quite the best-selling franchise of all time, but it's certainly the most consistently selling, no matter how bad any given year's entry might be. In my eyes, it's the only part of this entire deal that poses any immediate, tangible threat to Sony, and it's also the only reason Microsoft could possibly justify this purchase. Phil tweeted about Microsoft's desire to keep COD on PlayStation, but Jason Schreier's Bloomberg article more specifically guarantees the next 3 entries, along with the 2.0 version of Warzone. This is likely due to pre-existing contracts for early access to content, much like what happened with Deathloop and Ghostwire back when Bethesda was acquired. Sony partnered with Activision to get early access to things like DLC maps and betas for COD way back in the beginning of the PS4 generation. Ironically, it was actually Microsoft that had that deal before them back in the 360 days. Will we continue to see COD on PlayStation after that? I think the answer is a resounding no, despite the wording in Phil's tweet leaving room for alternative interpretations. I'm aware that Minecraft remains multi-platform despite Microsoft's ownership, but Starfield being 100% Xbox console exclusive so soon after the finalization of the Bethesda purchase proves to me that Minecraft is the exception, not the rule. And that makes perfect sense. You wouldn't spend $70 billion and then not reap the benefits of ownership. If that's how this plays out, that's huge. Other than maybe GTA, I can't think of another multi-platform franchise that would have a bigger impact from going exclusive. For a significant amount of people, COD is one of the few games they purchase every year, and it's a staple in their gaming diet. The default game, so to speak. This is not something that will kill the PlayStation brand, but for many, it might be the breaking point that makes it impossible to only have a PlayStation. Some will adapt by just owning 2 consoles, but for those who can't afford or justify 2 consoles, especially kids, it's a decision they'll have to weigh that they never did before. Either way, it's a win for Xbox. This is paradigm-shifting stuff, but it's the only thing on the Activision side, and when you look at Blizzard, I would argue they're even more dry, especially from an Xbox perspective. Diablo 4 has been shown a handful of times, and I think it looks pretty nice. Overwatch 2 was hyped up to high heaven when it was announced, and it just looks like some skins and a bare-bones campaign. Despite both being announced all the way back in 2019, they've been continuously delayed indefinitely, with Overwatch notably losing its well-known director Jeff Kaplan. It's got to the point where Blizzard won't even commit to a year for either of those games. It's fair to say that there are significant issues plaguing Blizzard behind the scenes, and aside from the Diablo 2 and Warcraft 3 remasters, they haven't shipped a game since Overwatch in 2016. Even if that wasn't the case, what's here for Xbox? These guys are primarily PC developers, and while the ports of Diablo and Overwatch have had moderate success on console, it's very much an afterthought. StarCraft, Warcraft, Heroes of the Storm, World of Warcraft. These are not games that would translate well or at all to console, not to mention they're not even what a console audience is looking for. They just stealth announced a new survival game. Okay, but what's Microsoft looking to do here? Resurrect Titan and compromise it so it can work better on console? Blizzard is an embattled developer, there is little to no synergy with Xbox, and they're just frankly kind of boring these days. It'll be at least 5 years before we see the first Microsoft-helmed Blizzard game, and if they want it to be an Xbox-focused game, which I would assume they would, that will be a fundamental divergence for this historically PC-centric developer. Many noticed and somewhat mocked the inclusion of King's infamous mobile game Candy Crush in the banner announcing this news. It's definitely one of those weird byproducts of a big merger, but I don't think people understand that it's a huge evergreen product that pulls in literally billions. But yet again, it's another thing that doesn't fit into the Xbox equation, and despite being obnoxiously pre-installed with Windows 10 for quite some time, I don't think it fits into Microsoft's equation either. Outside of the Surface Duo and some apps, they don't have any mobile business that this can neatly slot into. So that's everything they're getting. I don't think it's worth the money, even with COD, and even if it wasn't so expensive, I really struggle to see what Microsoft can do with all this. And the cons don't end there. There's also the issue of optics. If you're not super tuned into the minutiae of the gaming industry, you might not know that Activision faced a series of allegations late last year. It would be one thing if they were fresh off of that, but they're not. They're very much still actively embroiled in this. The sexual harassment, misconduct, and discrimination claims are numerous, they're well documented, and the most damning among them are truly ugly. Worse yet, it paints a picture of an environment where the higher-ups seem to have been well aware of this behavior and ignored it. This goes all the way up to CEO Bobby Kotick, who was rumored to have considered purchasing gaming outlets Kotaku and PC Gamer in an attempt to stop the flood of negative press. Which is just impressively shameless. It's like something Mr. Burns would do in an episode of The Simpsons. Microsoft themselves said they would be re-evaluating their relationship with Activision Blizzard in the wake of these reports, which makes it all the more confusing that they've now bought them and have decided to leave Kotick as CEO. A move that has drawn the ire of many, though it remains to be seen if he will stick around after the buyout is finalized. To me, a lot of this is just outright repugnant, but even if you're not outraged, which you definitely won't find me asking you to be, it matters even if you only care about the games. This broken culture that was, and perhaps still is, allowed to flourish had an actual impact on development and the end product, or in the case of Overwatch 2, the lack thereof. So even from a super detached, clinical perspective, this is still a massive concern. Will things be better under Microsoft? Well, you can't do worse than rock bottom, but they should have read the room and been ready to immediately communicate, in a direct and articulate manner, what their approach to this mess would be. And unless I've missed a PR statement, they haven't said a single word about it. Then there's the very legitimate question of if this deal will even be allowed to go through in regards to antitrust law. The general sentiment seems to be that it'll probably get through, but it's officially going to be reviewed by the FTC. And with the way the federal government has been putting the tech industry under a microscope for the past few years, usually to mixed results, you'd better bet that this will be a laborious investigation. $70 billion is an insane amount of money for any industry. That kind of cash is usually thrown around by governments, not publicly traded companies. The sheer enormity of that number is reason enough for attention, but it's a large consolidation of the US console gaming industry as well. When I think of big, US-based publishers that regularly put out console games, the names that come to mind are Take-Two, Bethesda, EA, and Activision. Microsoft will now own half of those, and Activision alone dwarfs the other three. But if Disney's $70 billion Fox deal was allowed to go through mostly unscathed, then I don't really see why this wouldn't. So why go to all this trouble to buy Activision? I don't think you can build a logical case for it, unless your plan is to just buy everything in sight. To me, that's not a positive thing, and I think it proves the Microsoft strategy is not holistic or focused. I'm also confused as to what their vision is for the Xbox Games Studios lineup, because I'm having a hard time getting excited for all these things that were already going to exist. At the risk of sounding like a so-called Sony pony, the PlayStation Studios roster has a certain level of cohesion, and they've been growing that lineup organically. Their games have a pattern, predominantly single-player, and within that, there's a specific type of high production value, third-person, story-heavy games. Now, you may or may not be a fan of that, but when people talk about PlayStation games, there's a clear idea of what that is. The only common thread I'm seeing on the Xbox side is that they're all not available on PlayStation. I'm not saying variety is bad, Sony certainly has a few blind spots, but as an outsider, I'm not seeing a vision for the type of game or even production level of game I should expect from Xbox. It all seems kind of random as it comes, and that lack of identity has already been haunting them for years. They want everything to be under the Game Pass model, which is not something I'm excited about, but many are, and it's inarguably a great value, even though I question how sustainable it is in its current form, and fear its inevitable influence on game development and the industry at large. Regardless, the Game Pass model has created a lot of positive buzz. But I don't think a delivery method for product can serve as an identity for the Xbox platform in perpetuity. Now that they're going to be so big with so many subsidiaries running with at least a little autonomy, it's going to be near impossible to curate that identity I'm looking for. Does it matter? Well, when Starfield rolls around later this year, they're going to sell consoles to people that would otherwise not have bought them. Same goes for when all this Activision stuff finally goes full Xbox exclusive. Results are results, but I can't get enthusiastic for a model that is essentially bullying the market with money. Right as I was finishing up this script, Sony had a bombshell announcement of their own that throws a bit of a wrench into that identity narrative. They're going to be buying Bungie for $3.6 billion, so maybe even their methodology is going away. In their PR statement, they say that Bungie will remain an independent and multi-platform studio and publisher, presumably forever. As someone who played Destiny religiously for years, it's extremely obvious to me that Bungie suffers from a lack of resources. So maybe even more so than Microsoft and Bethesda, I can see why being acquired, however ironic it may be, makes sense for them. Remaining multi-platform was likely a non-negotiable stipulation on Bungie's end, knowing how much they value their autonomy, which begs the question, why did Sony buy them? There's been some talk about them leveraging Destiny to make non-gaming content, which is interesting, I guess, but it's not a reason to drop $3.6 billion on a game studio. It's probably the most they've ever spent, and it's for a studio that doesn't fit very well into the PlayStation lineup, if you ask me. A purchase like this gives me the impression that they're feeling pressure from Microsoft's buying spree. It could have been anyone that bought Bungie, especially since they're remaining multi-plat, and it's hard to imagine Sony being that buyer in a world where Microsoft isn't buying everyone up. To be clear, there is a 0% chance that this is a direct response to the Activision purchase. This stuff takes months, not 2 weeks, but with Sony's Jim Ryan saying we can expect more acquisitions, I think it's safe to say we've officially entered the acquisition war era. Although Sony's move here isn't nearly as big or aggressive as Microsoft's, the message is just as strong. Everything is on the table and up for grabs, even if it doesn't really make sense. I have to admit that I'm disappointed to see Sony deviate in such a big way from their previously highly curated approach. They spent all of last year making smaller but logical and organic purchases of developers they'd done second-party work with like Housemarque and Bluepoint. Sony making that war declaration is fascinating, because if I were them, a resource-based pissing contest with Microsoft is the last thing I'd want to take part in. PlayStation division notwithstanding, Sony is a decrepit company with limited resources, while Microsoft is the second biggest company in the world by market cap. The only advantage Sony has is being Japanese, which may allow them to make purchases that Microsoft might not be able to. I think we can expect to see them pick up Square Enix, Capcom, or Sega, which to me would be every bit as boring and cynical as the Activision deal. Look, I'm not against all big acquisitions. I think Sony buying someone like Konami would be amazing and unlock a lot of otherwise completely wasted potential. But that's not what's going on here. It seems like there's a scramble, now on both sides, to snatch up every non-platform aligned player in the industry, until we reach the point where there are no true third parties. Complete and total consolidation of the industry is not something to get excited about. Any potential benefits are small and are certainly not worth the cost of having everything siloed into 2 or 3 conglomerates. As things continue to heat up, we're going to see a lot of money being thrown around, lots of hype being generated, but ultimately not much value being created as these existing assets are shuffled around. There are far more interesting and beneficial ways to spend money, creating new studios and further investing in existing ones to bring truly new creative endeavors to market, bringing both new value and competition. A sale as big as Activision is unprecedented, and if there's more of that on the way, as consumers and enthusiasts, we should be intensely skeptical of it no matter who's doing it or what platform we do or don't play on. Removing competition and having less independent entities is not healthy for any industry. Microsoft has now taken a significant step in that direction. I don't like it, and if Sony is heading down a similar path, I'm not going to like that either. If you enjoyed the video, likes and subscriptions are greatly appreciated. Until next time, thanks for watching.